Does Jesus being one with the Father mean that Jesus is God? Some people believe that Jesus is God because Jesus said he was one with the Father. This Bible point is at John chapter 10 verses 30. At John chapter 10 verses 30, Jesus says, I and the Father are one. So Jesus does say that he and the Father are one. Now, be mindful that Jesus says that he and the Father are one. Now, what does Jesus mean by this statement of him being one with the Father? Some people like to guess and say Jesus meant that he is God. However, it would be wise of us to let Jesus' words explain what this means. And at John chapter 17, verses 20 through 21. Again, that's John chapter 17, verses 20 through 21. Jesus points out the detailed definition meaning of how he is one with the Father. John chapter 17, verses 20 through 21 reads Jesus saying, I am praying not only for these disciples, but also for all who will believe in me through their word, that all of them may be one, just as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they may also be one in us. Now, at John chapter 17, verse 20, Jesus speak about how all his disciples and also the ones who are newcomers. So it's speaking about Jesus' disciples. Jesus speaking about all his disciples and the newcomers that believe through his disciples at John chapter 17, verse 20. And then at John chapter 17, verses 21, Jesus says how all of his disciples and new believers may be one. And now, be mindful, Jesus is talking about many humans, disciples, becoming one. One in what? How can many humans become being one? Well, Jesus explains how they should all become one, just as he and the Father are one. So right here, Jesus is illustrating how he and the Father are one in something, And he wants his followers to repeat that same pattern connection of being one with each other, coming together to be in one, just as he and the Father are one. Next, Jesus says at John chapter 17, verse 21, that they, who is all Jesus' disciples, that they may become one with Jesus and the Father. So, now, if we take this literally, that would mean that not only is Jesus one with the Father, but many, many others also. Which would mean all of Jesus' disciples are one with the Father and a multi-part of God, because they are one with each other in connection with being one with God. So do we conclude that Jesus is talking about all his disciples are God, another part of God too? All of Jesus' disciples could then claim, hey, we're God too. We are one with God. Because Jesus said we should become one, and we can become one with him in union with being one with God. That wouldn't make no sense. John chapter 17, verse 22 is where Jesus says, I have given them glory that you, who is Jesus talking about his Father, gave to me, who was Jesus the Son, that they, Jesus' disciples, may be one as we. Jesus is talking about him and the Father. So at John chapter 17, verse 22, Jesus speaks about the detailed formula of how his disciples can become one, just as him and the Father are one. Now, are all of Jesus' disciples put together actually one part of each other? No, they're separate beings that's a part of one harmony. So Jesus clearly explains what him and the Father being one means. Jesus does not say or explain that him being one with the Father means that Jesus is a second part of God or a third part of God at all. Jesus' words at John chapter 17, verse 22, which we just read, points out Jesus' explanation of what him being one with the Heavenly Father means. Jesus explains the meaning very simple and clear, and even makes a comparison illustration of how his disciples could become one, like he and the Father are one. And Jesus even went as far as to say they could become one in one completeness with him and the Father's oneness, which shows that Jesus is clearly talking about being one in a harmony with God's will. Now someone could say, well, it doesn't, Jesus doesn't say in this specific point he is one in harmony with God's will. Well, Jesus actually points that out, that he is in harmony with God's will. He's one in being in harmony with God's will. At John chapter 8, verse 29, Jesus says he always do what pleases the Father. which shows he's in harmony with the Father's will. He's one with the Father's will. If Jesus is doing everything that the Father pleases, he is in harmony with the will of the Father. He is one with the Father in the sense of being in harmony with the Father's will. Now at John chapter 8 verses 28, Jesus says he speaks exactly what God taught him. That's John chapter 8 verse 28. At John chapter 4 verses 34, Jesus says, my food is to do the will of the Heavenly Father who sent me. So at John chapter 4 verse 34, Jesus identifies how his will is to do the will of the Father, so much so it's as if it's his own food. So Jesus made it very clear in detail how he is one in harmony with the will of the Father, because Jesus did what the Father wanted and not what he wanted. So much so that Jesus reflected the will of the Father so perfectly. He could say, if you have seen him, you have seen the Father, as John chapter 14 verse 9 points out.